Making sure my hat's not on crooked this time. I know you care. So a long time ago, I came up with a video that was all about the limits of EQ and why you shouldn't feel confident about using EQ profiles that other people have created, like the ones that I've created as well. In that video, I basically told you not to do the things that I do myself, or told you the reasons to be careful about doing the things that I do myself. And now I'm going to go ahead and show you guys exactly how I go about doing that. Confused? Well, hopefully you won't be after this video. This is Andrew with headphones.com, and yes, today we're going to talk about how to do EQ. I'm going to give you guys my approach, and also I'm going to try and make this as beginner friendly as possible. A lot of you guys ask me, how do you do EQ? You talk all about, like how you can improve the sound of your headphones. How do you do that? What tools do you use? And so we're going to get into that in this video. I'm just going to let you guys know though what we're doing this with. Today I'm going to be showing you my process for EQing with the HiFiMAN Edition XS planar magnetic headphones. This is a pair of headphones that does not require EQ by any means. This is an example of how even great sounding headphones like this one can still be improved a little bit further with some subtle EQ adjustments. That's really more what this is about. It's about the setup for doing EQ, not a specific run through of like EQing like crazy fine-grained little things here and there. That's not what this is about. This is about just a very basic approach, which is also kind of how I incorporate EQ into my process and the kind of adjustments that I like to make. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is download an EQ program or EQ software. Now, I'm on Windows, so I'm going to use Equalizer APO and the PCUI. If you're on Mac, there are all kinds of other tools out there. I'll do a bit of research and leave some options linked down in the description. But the key thing here is to try and find something that has the same kind of functionality as the one I'm about to show you. And so make sure whatever one you end up getting allows you to input specific values for the frequencies that you're going to change. So the first thing you're going to download is Equalizer APO. That is the tool that has all the functionality, that is what actually does the change for all the different outputs that you have. And then you're also going to download this, the PCUI, which is basically the user interface that you interact with for the functionality. And just for reference, this is what Equalizer APO actually looks like. And this isn't something that you actually are going to be wanting to engage with or use. Rather, you're going to want to be using this, which is the PCUI. And this is a much easier way to actually make those adjustments. Anyways, this is what the PCUI looks like, and this is where you'll end up. But when you actually first start the PCUI and get things going, you're going to need to set this up with the devices that you're using. So if you're using headphones, for example, that's going to be plugged into something, and you're going to need to find out what that is and then enable that in this software. And this is something that you're going to have to do likely more than once if you have multiple different devices that you're trying to make adjustments for. So that's in the settings tab here, and that looks like this. This is also something that might show up for you right away when you first start this program. And you're going to go into the debugging and testing section here, all right? Then you're going to go into Equalizer APO's configurator, and then you're going to see all the different potential devices that you could enable this for, or this could be installed for. Once you select a particular device, it's going to actually ask you right here to restart your computer. Now, I've already done that for the devices that I'm using. You can see here it's the LAQ-XD1 DAC, but you're going to need to essentially figure out which device it is that you want to adjust, whether it's a DAC, whether it's your onboard, or maybe it's a monitor. You don't know why you'd be EQing for a monitor, but you get the idea, right? Like you need to actually specify which device it is and then enable that, restart your computer, and then go back to the PCUI, start that up again, and then this is what you're going to be faced with. You're going to see it like this. Now, I'm just going to quickly go over here what each individual things do. So at the top, you have your preamplifying. This is what you're going to end up needing to adjust after you do all of your EQ, because you're going to need to go negative on this, to a point that's below the highest point where you've made your adjustment. And I'll get to that in a moment. But first, the frequencies that you're going to be adjusting are up here, and you can change these values. And again, this is where with Mac, you're going to want to find a program that allows you to do exactly this, change the values. And you can also add more by hitting this plus if you want additional filters here. But this is more than enough for what I think is optimal for doing EQ. In any case, the gain sliders here, you can actually adjust this stuff, and then you see the number shows up down here, but you can also input those values like, whatever you want, and it'll just snap to that, right? So I'm going to reset this to 0. And then the Q the Q values here underneath, you see 1.41, 1.2, 3, etc. That's how wide or how narrow a frequency range you're going to be adjusting. And the key thing here is that the lower the number here, the wider the range, the higher the number, the narrower. And let me just show you what that looks like here. This button here shows you what your actual adjustments are. Say you're going to boost 1.3K by 3 dB. Right, with a 1.4 Q, that's what that looks like, right? It's a fairly wide adjustment. If you want to make that narrower, just for argument's sake, I don't recommend going too far here, but you could increase the number. The higher the number, the narrower the adjustment. The lower the number, the wider, right? You can go down to 1.2 and make it even wider. So you get the idea. That's sort of what that does. Now, the other key thing here with making these adjustments with these types of filters here, and I'll get to that in a second, but essentially, the different adjustments you make, the wider they are, the more they're going to come in contact with other filters that you have. So for example, I have one here at 1.3K at, with a Q value of 1.2. It's a fairly wide filter. Say I have another adjustment that I want to make at 2K, and I also have that at a fairly wide Q value. That's not going to just impact 2K, right? That's going to impact 2K and the frequencies around it, depending on how low or how high this number is. So you'll see here, the overall level is actually more than the highest that I've gone here. The overall level is at 4. So the boosts that you're making here, or the reductions, right, they actually influence one another. And so that's why when you're done with your EQ, after you've put in all the settings, click this button to see what the actual curve adjustment is that you've made and see if that lines up with the overall amount that you want the adjustment to be. And oftentimes this is a big mistake that I see people make. They will reduce the preamplifying when they're done by a little bit more than what the highest value here is, for the adjustments that they've made. And really what they need to do is they need to look at this number right here. That's the highest the overall level is of the adjustment, and you need to adjust your pre-gain by more than that, right? So negative 4.5 because I've gone up to 4 here. If you don't do this, if you don't make adjustments to pre-gain, you are going to run into clipping unless you also reduce your digital volume, which you could theoretically do, but I know a lot of people who just have their digital volume maxed out, and in that case, you would run into clipping issues if you didn't adjust the pre-gain. Now, there's one last thing here. This filter type here, I mentioned that earlier, these are all just peak filters. That's the default filters that you can use, but there's a whole bunch of different ones. When you're making these adjustments, I recommend just focusing on 3. The most common one is going to be the peak filter, but using a low shell filter makes a certain amount of sense, and also using a high shell filter makes a certain amount of sense. These are the ones that are the most, the widest, basically. It allows you to kind of influence the widest frequency ranges. And I'll show you what that looks like with, for example, a very common low shell filter here. I'm going to do it in the bass. I'm going to add a low shell filter instead of a peak filter. Say we want to do 100 Hertz, that's kind of like mid bass and sub bass, and boost that by 3.5, and you can see it goes up here as well, right? That's essentially what this does. Rather than having to individually individually add peak filters all the way down to get that effect, you can just add one filter, low shell filter, and it does all of that for you. Fantastic. Okay, moving on to the adjustments that we're going to make for the HiFiMAN Edition XS. I've already got some settings there if you want to use them as a starting point, which is, remember from the previous video that I did, don't just throw them on fire and forget. Actually use your ears and see if the adjustments are the ones that you like. As a starting point, you could use those, but I'm going to kind of go through this process for those who are potentially looking at other headphones and they want to make those EQ adjustments for themselves. Just apply this same idea to any headphones that you might have and see if you're able to get it to something that you like. And keeping in mind that not everybody has an industry standard measurement rig, we're going to try and do a lot of this by eyeballing it without relying on measuring it after the fact and then ending up with a perfect result, because that's not realistic for everybody. So here's the frequency response of the HiFiMAN Edition XS. When you're looking up the graphs here to make these adjustments, don't think that the dotted line or the target here is like the perfect word for the best sound quality or anything like that. This is just something that we know that most people like. Okay, so it's a reference point. And if you want to get it closer to the reference point, you can adjust it to the target below 5K. Great. But You may also want more bass. You may be in the grouping that wants less bass, right? So do all of this to your preference, but as an example, I'm going to show you what it would look like if we're going to make adjustments to kind of get closer to the reference point. That's what a lot of people are doing. It's fairly common. It's what a lot of profiles kind of aim towards, and it makes a certain amount of sense because it's what we know most people like. In this case, the HiFiMAN Edition XS also measured on the industry standard Gross 43AG. Make sure that the measurements that you're using here for this are done on industry standard measurement rigs, not the mini DSP ears, not some of the other flat plate stuff, but actually, you know, a industry standard rig. You can use the measurements that we've done here that are up on the Headphone community forum, and there's a link to a database of that below, but these are also compatible with the ones that Critical has done on his website. I'll leave that linked as well. So, you know, there's lots of different places where you can find these measurements. Just make sure that they're done on these industry standard rigs, because otherwise it's sort of pointless. But nonetheless, let's just move ahead with the EQing this. So the first thing that I do is I just look at the bass and I say, okay, roughly maybe like 70 hertz, 70, 80 hertz is where we would want to boost it a little bit. So let's just go 75. And this is, again, all totally to taste, right? I'm just going to zero this out. We'll do this afterwards. The bass, totally up to your preference, right? Like, I mean, all of this technically is, but as an example, let's say we want to boost that by like 3 dB, or I guess we'll go a little higher because I'm Canadian and all Canadians like a lot of bass. That's how that works. At 200 hertz, I'm going to do it in 2 filters because there's a little bump here as well. So I'm going to go around 200, and I'm going to do a fairly wide, I've already at 1.2 here, fairly wide Q value there. And this is, here's the key, be very subtle with your adjustments. Okay, I know lots of people are bass heads, that's fine. Do not go crazy with this, okay? Like I know people who've like damaged headphones because they're like, let's go all the bass and be ridiculous. Like just be subtle here, guys. But yeah, so 200 hertz, dropping that by 1.5. And then I'm also going to go, let's say 370-ish. And here's where I'm going to go a little bit narrower, right? Because it tapers off pretty early. Now, the rest of these, you see these sort of wibbles going on here. That's basically driver modes. And these are things that are going to be slightly different on a unit-to-unit basis, pretty commonly at least. And I honestly don't even bother. If you smooth this to the same degree as the target, it would look, you know, basically the same there. So I don't really bother with that. What I do bother with is this whole section, right? This kind of typical mid-range dip that you see in the HiFiMAN headphones. It's one of the things that kind of aids in the presentation of soundstage. You don't have to EQ this, of course. Again, this headphone is one that already sounds great without EQ, but this is an area where if you want to get a little bit more of that focus in the mid-range back, you can. And so I boost that. I'm going to try here at around 1.5K by about 3 dB. Let's try that. All right, 1.5, and we're going to boost that by like 3 dB, and we'll go with a fairly wide Q. I think you could do this in a number of stages. You could have 2 filters, 1.5, and then maybe something a little bit closer to here. We have actually a pretty high level at around 3K, and we don't want to go too far on that because otherwise it'd be shouty, right? So again, we want to be a little conservative here and make sure that the adjustment that we're making is localized to this region and doesn't affect, you know, the upper mids too strongly, right? So then moving on from there, we can take a look at the rest of the frequency response and say, okay, well, there's a bunch of other different deviations and stuff like that. But here is where we have to stop. We just stop looking at the graph because for the reasons that I mentioned in the previous video, you can't be confident about your adjustments above 5K. Because it's going to be totally different depending on the coupling, depending on the unit, depending on the features that are going on with the measurement rig. You know, there's way too many variables there, and you have to do the stuff above 5K by ear, unless, of course, you have very significant deviations going on, the ones that are really obvious. In this case, though, they're not that significant. They're fairly minor deviations on the measurement rig. You also don't know exactly how this is going to be on your head, right? So what we're going to do here is basically start doing EQ by ear. This may be a little bit here that we could reduce at around like 4.8K. Sure, let's do that. Just for argument's sake, right? Let's reduce 4.8 by 2 dB with a narrow Q. Probably go even higher than that, but I generally don't recommend doing that. But okay, so from there, You know, if you were doing an apples to apples comparison with the target here, you wouldn't see this ragged, you know, response. Plus this area down here, the 9K dip you see, you do not want to EQ that up if you see a 9K dip, because that's the interaction with one of the features of the ear that the measurement rig uses. Okay, so this means that if you were to EQ that to match the target, you would end up with a 9K peak, and you don't want to do that. So basically, for the reasons that I mentioned in that previous video, again, if you haven't seen that yet, now is the time to watch it, because you're now already an expert on EQing things. Don't make adjustments to the graph above 5K. That's where you need to start dialing stuff in by ear. In this particular case, I do know that I find 12K, that region kind of up there, to be a little bit on the sharp side, but I'm not going to be so surgical with my adjustment that this is the specific place where I drop it. That's something that I'm only really able to assess by listening to the headphone with a series of test tracks that I know specifically what I'm listening for. And in this case, it happens to be cymbal hits and things like that. So what I do here is I'll go 12K, and I'm going to reduce that by maybe like 2.5. I could go maybe 3 dB. Let's just leave it at 2.5. And this adjustment here, I'm leaving it at 3. If I were to actually reduce it based on the graph, it would be a more narrow value here. But because of positional variance and these rigs not rated for accuracy above 10K, I don't want to be so surgical with my EQ in that region, because there's a chance that it could be in the wrong spot. Now, something else that you could try just by looking at the treble response here is, rather than dropping 12K by a little bit, let's just pop that back up, you could try dropping this whole frequency range with a high shelf filter. Let me show you what that looks like. So instead of doing the peak filter at 4.8K, we'll just use that spot to sort of drop everything down and kind of relax the whole treble region. So this is what that looks like. You go to high shelf filter, and let's leave it at the same value here, -2. And this is what that looks like, right? So we go all the way down, and that's going to make, the treble a little bit more relaxed for people who want the treble to be a little bit more relaxed than what the default tuning is here. Now, for me, the reason I'm not doing that in this case is, when actually listening to it, I don't find myself to be particularly bothered by where the mid treble is at. It's only really the upper treble that I find to be a little bit on the zingy side with this headphone. And so that's where I kind of drop that down a little bit. So I do go a little bit more surgical in the upper frequencies, just because I know, from having listened to it, that that's kind of how that sounds to me, and, where my preference for that region falls. But in some ways, for situations like this, I actually recommend using a shelf filter instead, just so that you keep, the rest of the balance intact. Now, at this stage, let's assume that you've gone in and made some adjustments, above 5K to your own ear, but this is where I basically say, that's up to you now. You decide what's left, right? You have all the knowledge that you need. Maybe you find that there actually is a dip for you at around 6K, right? So these are the things that you have to try. Put in a value of 6K somewhere, right? And make your adjustment there. That would be pretty narrow, so you'd want to go 4, and then you could boost that, right? And see how that sounds. And then, and I mean with music, right? Like, actually listen to music, make this adjustment, turn, and then, take it back down and see what you prefer. There are other ways of doing this with slow sweeps. You can get a sense, but you have to not chase equal loudness. If there's one thing you take away from this video, do not chase equal loudness, because that will lead to a very wrong sounding result. The reason for that is because there are sounds that we hear naturally that aren't meant to be equal loud. Now, let's assume that you're ready to dial stuff in by ear and you're ready to, see how things go. You're not quite done yet. You're not at that stage yet. You still need to double check. Let's get rid of this graph. You still need to double check what your overall level is at and reduce your preamplifying by more than that. And again, you don't want to be doing that by these values here, right? Because they could be more or less depending on the other adjustments that you've made. You want to be doing it by this number here. Now, in this case, we haven't really made that many adjustments that are close enough to one another where they're compounding with one another. So it's not really an issue here, but still you want to be looking at this number up here. So here in this case, we're going to go -4. And now we're basically done. And this is going to start to sound really, really, really nice. Here's where we go, save it as Edition XS, resolve told me to do this. That way you don't lose this, and you're able to kind of reference that and go back and reference it. Now, one thing also, I just want to let you guys know, if you want to test to see your EQ versus the original frequency response, right? The default tuning versus what you've done with your adjustment here. This is actually where you're going to reduce your digital volume on your player, the music player that you're using, to like half, 50% is fine. Turn up your amplifier a little bit, and then turn your pregain to 0. And this way you're actually getting a level comparison, because otherwise you're going to constantly be going with the quieter EQ profile, EQ settings that you've put together versus the much louder, default tuning. And so this is when you toggle it on and off, right? This is when you go, okay, does it sound better like this? And then you turn it on, you go, okay, it sounds better. But the key there is make sure that your digital volume is reduced so that you're not clipping with the profile on. And then, once you're very confident in the result, you're like, oh, I like the way that this sounds. That's when you then, drop this back down to whatever is more than your highest level there. Okay, hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So that's basically how I recommend getting into EQ and doing EQ, setting it up, and then kind of going through the steps. And here's the thing. You don't have to use the graph to do this. You can actually just do all of this by ear. But if you have the graph, at the very least, you can see where some of the more major things would be. And so the graph, at least up to a point, kind of helps you get a sense of which frequency ranges you should be looking at and should be targeting for those adjustments. It's the starting point. But all of this needs to be done by ear as well. You need to be listening and making sure that the adjustments that you've made are actually sounding good to you. Because if it doesn't, then what's the point, right? Now, with the Audition XS, it's a fairly easy headphone to EQ. It's fairly easy to, there's not that much that you really need to do with it. It gets a little bit more tricky when the headphones have more significant issues with the tonal balance and the frequency response. But in both cases, there is a point at which you can't rely on the graph. You have to use your ears, and that's where it helps to have a set list of recordings that you can kind of go through and test your EQ with to see if it actually ended up making it sound better to you. In any case, I might do another video in the future with a more difficult headphone to EQ, where there's more tricky issues to kind of solve. The idea here is to make that as easy for you and not also relying on a lot of those profiles that people make online. Some of the profiles, they're done really well and they're done by ear for those regions above 5K. Like the ones from Oratory are the ones that I do recommend trying, but even still, it's probably worth dialing some of those in yourself above 5K just so that you can kind of get that to be more specific to you. That's the whole point of EQ in the first place. Now, just before I let you guys go here, I just want to draw your attention to some of the review articles that we do up on headphones.com. If you are looking for more, articles, written format reviews from myself, but also a lot of the creators that you see on the channel and more. This is the place for that. And we also do educational articles kind of along the lines of this video, and we post those up here as well. In addition to that, there is also the Headphone Community Forum, and this is where you can find all the graphs and stuff like that if that's what you're looking for. But in any case, that does it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.